Assalamu alaikum. Hello and welcome to Africa This Week with me, Anissa Omar. Much has taken place this week on the continent. We'll be looking at child exploitation in the cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Our reporter Yasmin Khatun also gives us articles that caught our eye this week. The World Economic Forum, Davos, has been taking place this week, so we'll analyse the increase of innovation and entrepreneurship in the African continent and how tomatoes could make a difference to Nigeria's ailing economy. But first, fighters in Burkina Faso have attacked a restaurant and a hotel capital in Ouagadougou last weekend. More than 30 people lost their lives in the attack. Davide Salve has more on the aftermath of this attack and the rest of the week's headline news.
"30 people have died during an attack in the capital of Burkina Faso. Heavily armed gunmen attacked the Cappuccino restaurant and the splendid hotel in the heart of Ouagadougou. Police was able to set 126 hostages free and kill the 3 perpetrators. According to the prosecutor's office, 6 Canadians, 2 French nationals, 2 Swiss, an American, a Portuguese and a Dutch citizen were killed. The attack was claimed by Al-Murabitoun, a group with ties with Al-Qaeda in North Africa. The group had also claimed responsibility for the attack in Bamako last November. The Malian Prime Minister Keïta called for unity in the fight against terrorism.
Défendre l'idée selon laquelle il faut avoir un groupe d'intervention rapide au niveau du 5 Sahel. Voilà des actions concrètes. Je sais que ce n'est pas facile, mais c'est parce que ce n'est pas facile qu'il faut y aller.
After a new case of Ebola, the government of Sierra Leone announced that more than 100 people have been quarantined. The World Health Organization confirmed that a 22-year-old student died after contracting the virus. Health officials said they had placed in isolation 109 people who had been in contact with the student before her death. The news came just one day after the announcement that West Africa was free from Ebola. Liberia became the latest of the 3 worst-hit countries in the region to be declared Ebola-free. Sierra Leone had received the all clear last November and Guinea in December. Nigerian soldiers freed 6 Cameroon hostages in the hands of the group Boko Haram. The 6 men were presented to the governor of the Far North region after taking medical examinations. They are all from the country's west region. They were abducted on June last year while traveling to Marua from Kuseri. They escaped after a raid by Cameroonian and Nigerian forces on the group Boko Haram positions and later rescued by the soldiers. South Africa is experiencing its 2nd year of drought. Volunteers are collecting tens of thousands of liters of water and sending them by truck to the country's driest towns. Lydia Venter and her family have asked their neighbors and friends to help those without water.
We saw posts of animals from the farmers and everyone that was dying, and my sister came across Water Shortage SA, and we saw people were making collection points, and we decided to make a collection point in our area.
Delivering water is just one short-term measure. According to South Africa's Water Research Commission, the country needs to find lasting solutions, starting with curbing waste. 30 people have died after the group Al-Shabaab stormed the seaside restaurant in Mogadishu. After an explosion, gunmen burst into the restaurant as diners were sitting down for their evening meal. Witnesses said a wedding ceremony was taking place at the hall of the restaurant. Troops then besieged the attackers at the restaurant for 8 hours. It was not immediately clear how many of the militants were killed or captured. The Somali authorities said the leader of the attack had been arrested. Using a pick to pound the rocks, David is looking for cobalt. He is among over 100,000 men working as artisanal or small-scale miners in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's a difficult job, but for many of these men, it's the only way to survive.
We're not formally employed, we've just come to find something to eat.
According to the miners, this land belongs to the relative of a senior Congolese leader who's allowed them to mine in return for 30% of their production. It's only the men who go underground. Women and children stay on the surface to wash the mixture of earth and rock, looking for cobalt.
I came here to help my husband. There isn't any work apart from this. The work is hard. He can't do it alone.
This cobalt will be sold to Chinese dealers operating a few kilometers from the mine. But the miners don't trust them, claiming they deliberately cheat the scales.
When you bring them 100 kilos, those 100 kilos become 80 kilos. So you've already lost 20 kilos. When you take your product to Kolwezi, for example, they'll give you 10% cobalt content. But when you go to the Chinese, they'll give you only 5 or 6%, you see?
These artisanal miners aren't working illegally, but they aren't protected by the law either. Left to fend for themselves against unscrupulous dealers, they earn a few $100s a month for a mineral that's in global demand.
Amnesty International released a report this week looking into this issue, entitled "This is what we die for: Human rights abuses in the Democratic Republic of Congo power the global trade in cobalt." Joining us from Amnesty is Lauren Amstead, a human rights campaigner who focuses on supply chains and conflict minerals, especially in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's great to have you on the show, Lauren. So, looking into your report, what were the main human rights abuses that came out of it?
Well, I think what we wanted to show with this research and the report, "This is what we die for," is that all too often the big multinational companies, like Sony, Samsung, Apple, who make huge profits, are ignoring what's going on at the beginning of their supply chain, and they're not doing enough to find out where the minerals and the high-tech products are coming from. And, when we were there, what struck me was the contrast between how easy these products have made our lives. The progress and the technological advances that these have brought, with the difficult situation on the ground. These people are working very long hours. There are children as young as 7 sorting rocks. The majority of the children are engaged in work on the surface. They often sort the rocks and they wash the rocks. And they often carry bags, that they said were heavier than their weight. And then the adults are working in the same conditions. Women are also washing the minerals in lakes. They're standing there in water for hours on end, in the rain, in high temperatures.
Absolutely horrendous to hear such imagery. What are the situation in terms of dates? How long has this been going on?
Artisanal mining in the DRC has been going on for quite a while, ever since the big mining company, Gécamine, kind of failed in some respects. People went out and they dug for themselves. In the report we talk about how Laurent Kabila during the Second Congo War couldn't attract the investment in industrial mining. So said that people should pick up tools themselves and go out and work for themselves. And then he set up the government agency called SESCAM, which is the service. It's kind of an assistance and training service for small-scale mining and artisanal mining. And they're supposed to support artisanal miners, but essentially, the figures for the number of artisanal miners in Katanga, or the former province of Katanga, because it's now been divided into 4, are about 150,000 artisanal miners. And, of those, UNICEF say that there's 40,000 child miners working across the ex-province of Katanga. So it's a lot of people. It affects a huge number of people. And the conditions in many of these mines are just appalling.
So would you say that the needs are both local and international, or would you say it's more of the multinationals to blame for this rise?
I think everyone has a responsibility. That responsibility varies according to where exactly they are in the chain. The companies like Apple, Sony and Samsung should be at least identifying who their smelters are, the companies that essentially buy the raw minerals and melt and refine it. So companies like Apple, should be complying with the international standards, at least to identify those companies. And then they should also be ensuring that those companies, for instance, Huayu Cobalt in this case, are acting to tackle the abuse. So they have a different level of responsibility according to international standards, according to where they are in the chain, but they've all got a responsibility. And you know what our report shows is that at the moment, no one's doing anything.
And would you say that's because of weak governments, the fact that they're working in developing countries and therefore to some degree can take advantage of that situation?
I mean, certainly it is for the government to act. You know, it is first and foremost the place of the DRC government to act. It needs better laws and it needs better enforcement. And it also needs to tackle the problem of child labour, you know, not just by taking the children out of schools, but it needs to, you know, it needs a multi-pronged approach to tackle such a difficult and often multi-generational problem. But also, you know, companies can work with the DRC government. They should ensure their suppliers are respecting international standards and the DRC's own laws, and they should then, you know, work with the DRC government to put in place a plan to remove children from the mines and help them go to school, because, you know, the problem is that a lot of these children can't afford to go to school, so they go to the mines to earn money to then be able to pay for school fees.
So this report not only is it research, but it's also data that would otherwise not be there. So are governments using this data wisely, or would you say that it's data just unused?
I mean, you know, the thing is that the data's out there. I mean, we reconstructed this supply chain just by using publicly available documents. We used investor documents, we used annual reports, we used information that was found on websites. So, you know, the fact is a lot of these multinational companies are hiding behind the complexity of the supply chain and how difficult it is to apparently trace it. But, you know, we've managed to do it, and so if we can do it, they can.
And what can the government do to really create initiatives that are local to combat these human rights abuses?
Well, I mean, the DRC government firstly, I mean, the DRC government should ensure that there's free education, you know, free and obligatory primary education for all. At the moment, you know, what our report shows is that that's not being fulfilled. A lot of schools, you know, because they lack government funding, are having to impose fees on children. So the children can't pay these fees. So first of all, I mean, it's an issue about schooling. You know, children should be able to attend school. But also, you know, the governments of companies, you know, the big multinational companies, should also be ensuring that the companies in their jurisdiction are respecting human rights. You know, we are calling on governments to hold companies accountable. You know, at the moment, the kind of global market of cobalt is completely unregulated, and that's one of the problems.
And in terms of bringing it back, as you said, to the issue of cobalt, it's not just multinationals, it's also countries. I understand, as the video prior showed us, that China is also involved in terms of not only buying cobalt, but buying it at a lower rate than other countries. What is your thoughts on this issue?
I mean, we haven't investigated that. We haven't done any research on the relative prices. You know, but Huayu Cobalt buys, I mean, we don't know about other Chinese companies. I'd like to, you know, have to point out we've only investigated one Chinese company that does claim to be one of the biggest cobalt, you know, refineries and smelters in the world and in China. So obviously they are quite, you know, they're significant. And they buy their cobalt from the market where artisanal miners sell their produce. I'm sure that as a result that the price is lower than potentially, you know, if you had your own industrial mine. I mean, they need to work with those miners. Huayu Cobalt needs to work with those particular mines to improve the situation. You know, I don't know about why they're obviously, the pricing we haven't investigated, but, you know, where you search for just the cheapest thing, you can often find, you know, that there are problems.
So the responsibility and the accountability is really for all, and there's much to learn and to go on with this issue. Thank you, Lauren, for your comments. and interesting developments, and we're keeping an eye more on that. Now we're moving on to comments from our reporter Yasmin Khatun in regards to articles of this week. So Yasmin, what are the articles of this week?
So the first one we've got here, the Burkina Faso attack shows how Al-Qaeda is exploiting weak governments in West Africa. Now, this comes after there was an attack in Burkina Faso that left 28 people dead and 55 injured last Friday. And I guess it's talking about the vacuum that's often left by conflict, by warring parties, when there are disputes. When these things happen, there is often a vacuum left, and often these groups then take advantage of these vacuums and then come in. So we've got a high presence of groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, as we've seen in countries such as Libya, come in and grow inside these countries. And in Burkina Faso,
would you say that this is just not just the Burkina Faso issue, it's more of a regional
Mali
conflict?
It's not even just a regional issue, because it ranges from West Africa all the way up to North Africa onto the Middle East. You know, when there is a vacuum, there will be a need or call out from people for some sort of rescue, almost, to come out of these sorts of situations. And in those situations, that's where we see the growth of such groups like Al-Qaeda and like Islamic State.
Interesting. So what's our second article?
And the second article we've got here is on Martin Luther King Jr. on South Africa. Now, this is quite interesting because, of course, we know there's a commemoration for Martin Luther King Jr. In the US. There was a national holiday. This is about his relationship with South Africa. And we know that he was very fond of the region, and he looked, was very much inspired by what took place, in there going forward. But this article is drawing parallels to what happened in South Africa to the struggle for Black African Americans in the US. The struggles are very different, and this article does note that they're very different. For example, in South Africa, often even very small civilian disruption or civilian protest was clamped down on straight away, whereas in the US it sort of took charge.
More of a political awakening consciousness in Africa, and mirroring with America. Very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite interesting that this piece was written, on America's national holiday, remembering Martin Luther King, and making that connection.
Martin Luther King? I know not everyone, but I'm hoping everyone knows. But if you could tell our audiences a little bit.
Well, leading figure in the civil rights movement in the US, of course, incited many change and much change of what we saw there. Figure that's often contrasted against Malcolm X, but back then, absolutely. So contrasted against some of the other movements that we've seen there, but a figure noted for his peaceful activism and his inspiring motive for change in the US.
Love it. So what's the third article?
The third piece we've got here is looking at the WFP report, which has come out on Central African Republic. Now, this notes that almost half of the population, 2.5 million people in the country, are in hunger.
Staggering amounts.
Absolutely devastating report. I mean, the report came out, following on from last week where we heard about the sexual abuse allegations. The week before, we continually, every week, we're almost hearing something new, which is, a new devastation in Central African Republic. Now, also in the report, what we see is there are also thousands of men, women, and children who are in desperate poverty. Now, the 2.5 million are hungry. They're not receiving the nutrition that they need. They are suffering, and this, of course, leads to some of the diseases and illnesses that we have seen, and we have seen rising in the Central African Republic.
I think it's doubled in a year.
Absolutely. So now the 2.5 million figure last year, that was half. That was 1.25. For that to have doubled, and this is now half of the population. It's no small feat in a country which is continually. And we know there have been recent elections, so we are hoping for some sort of change. But the recent elections saw, old foes back into the same seats that they were in. So I'm not sure that we'll actually see the change that we do want to see. But we're hoping that some sort of activity will be taken, or some sort of charge will be taken, in order for international nations to also play a role in, feeding and changing the numbers we're seeing.
Yes, I know that you've been to the Central African Republic, and you know a lot more in terms of what the NGOs are doing there. Would you say that they're doing a lot on the ground to help such issues?
They are. I mean, the WFP is, of course, one of the leading, organisations, the United Nations World Food Programme, in providing aid in the country. I mean, they show that, they provided food for nearly 400,000 people, and this particular article does note that. And there are other NGOs and charities in the country. Médecins Sans Frontières, is critical to the country. But some of the things they have noted right from the get-go of this recent conflict, Médecins Sans Frontières just said, why aren't we receiving more support? The Central African Republic hasn't got this nickname, the forgotten conflict, for no reason. People just don't pay enough attention to what's going on there. And as we're seeing, you know, hunger is rising. It's not getting better.
And these are not any small numbers. This is
absolutely. And one of the things, I guess, you know, is one of the things that come up when you speak to the World Food Programme or other charities. They say, if you look at the roads in Central African Republic, now this is, just to put into context, this is a country bigger than France. Only 700 kilometers of the roads there are actually tarred. So the rest of those roads there are all mud. And so if it's raining, if there's been any downpouring, you can't move anything in the country. To try and get aid from one place to another is extraordinarily difficult. And this is something the World Food Programme said to me. This is something I experienced myself when I went there, travelling from one refugee camp to another on the Chadian borders of the Central African Republic. We were told if we didn't leave the camp within 20 minutes, it was going to start raining and we wouldn't be able to leave for another 2 days.
The NGOs are really doing their part, aren't they?
Absolutely. It's a difficult place to get aid into because of the fact that there aren't the roads and the infrastructure to do so. But we do need to see more action, more attention, and we need people to really want to see change there because the international efforts really could be better.
A lot to take in there. So what is your fourth article?
Our last article here is Remembering Patrice Lumumba, remembering Africa's Che Guevara. Now, he, of course, is an inspirational figure.
Very cool guy.
Absolutely, absolutely, as I've heard from yourself also. Now, this article notes a lot about him. I guess it's running through why he was so inspirational, why he incited so much enthusiasm about him, and also the sadness of his assassination at the hands of the US. Of course, it notes here Lumumba publicly denounced Belgium for its brutal colonial methods. He was a young leader wanting to see change.
The first democratic young leader.
Absolutely.
Post-colonial state.
And this is something that, you know, is often, we don't always see. In many of these African nations, a lot of corruption is dealt at the hands of the leaders of these countries. So he's still remembered, you know, for his inspiration, even though, you know, the crime took place, his death was 1961, you know, all this time later. And we know that there are some trials taking place to hold certain people to account to this day. So he's still an inspirational figure. And, you know, quotes like Lumumba wanted to free the country from its colonial shackles.
Only 4 months in power, I remember.
Yes, absolutely. And those Belgian socialists.
What to do next on that, really?
No, absolutely. The Belgian socialists wrote, this is why they decided to get rid of the new government and Lumumba himself, because he wanted to free the country from its colonial shackles. And that seems to be the story of many African countries, where they are trapped into these boxes that they can't remove. And when somebody like him comes about, you know, he's often taken out. There are a number of really quite inspirational quotes here, and I think that's why this piece almost sort of hawks at something, just trying to tell his story and tell people why he was so inspirational. You know, calling him a Che Guevara-like figure, you know, that's one to inspire others.
And to remember, and we've remembered him right here.
Absolutely.
Well, now we'll be going for a short break. When we come back, we'll be looking at how Africa is leading the way in innovation and entrepreneurship. See you there.